而家企喺凳前邊啦，拉張凳，唔係拉張凳。都係走張凳。係啊。你嗰晚你可唔可以撳低啲啊？唔該晒，唔該晒啊。好冇機。好。好，咁多位中間呢度啊，走。好望出嚟。三位呢邊，三位呢邊啊，好。
好，三位中間。
再望左手邊啊，三位。我哋三。中間就中間，唔該。後面 cam 咩？後面 cam 咩？後面 OK。
唔好意思，左手邊嘅嚟緊嘅。
好。後面中間唔該。好，唔該晒啊。
好，唔該。好。
歡迎大家今日嚟到立法會。
Welcome to this press conference on the proposed consultation in respect of the Legislative Council election. We have the Honourable Mr. Justice Barnabas Fong Hua, Chairman of the EAC, and Professor Fanny Zhang, Mr. Arthur Look, Mr. Alan Yong, and Ms. Jennifer Chan, Ms. Jenny Chan, briefing you on the proposed consultation. Welcome to this press conference on the election-related activities in respect of the Electoral Council election, a proposed consultation. Let me talk about the election last year, the District Council election last year. The elections were held under difficult conditions. The EAC is of the view that the elections were held in an honest and transparent manner. On the whole, the process, the voting process and counting process were smooth and orderly. Of course, there were some petitions and challenges arising from that, but that doesn't affect the overall orderly achievement. I would like to thank all working staff involved in the arrangement, the government bureaus and departments for their able support. And above all, I would like to thank all the voters who supported the election and who acted in a peaceful manner. In the third quarter this year, we're going to have the next general election of LegCo. I hope we can all treasure the peaceful tradition of our electoral systems so that the activities and the polling can be conducted in an orderly and peaceful manner. As for the guidelines, it's the usual practice of the EAC to review and update activities-related guidelines every time before a general election is held. And also, of course, the guidelines will be applicable to both the general election and by-elections, if any. The guidelines are there for all to follow in order that the elections can be conducted in a transparent and fair manner. And we have now come up with some proposals for the coming electoral election. We're going to conduct a 30-day public consultation, and that is the consultation period ends on the 7th of April. The guidelines come in two groups. First, we would elaborate the relevant legislative provisions related to such elections. Secondly, based on the principle of transparent and fairness, we come up with some fairness on how election activities should be conducted. This time we have also got a preamble to the consultation document setting out the principles. Such guidelines are based on the existing ones, subject to revisions and proposed changes. First of all, there might have been some legislative amendments to the electoral legislation, and secondly, we may make reference to past experience in order that we can update the guidelines regularly. And for some provisions and principles, we have tried to elaborate on the principle behind such rules. So you may wish to refer to the general provisions chapter, and you could understand why we have to specify certain steps and procedures to be followed. We have also learned from the past district council elections. Some recommendations have been made. They are nothing more than recommendations. And we just want to put this forward for public consultation. Public views are welcome. And I would take this opportunity to highlight some of the proposals. First, on the queuing arrangement for polling stations. In the 2019 DC election, as in the past, 15 hours was allowed for polling, but many voters turned up in the first 3 hours of the day. Therefore, the long queues were found in many polling stations. When the EAC realized this on polling day, we instructed the presiding officer to come up with a fair arrangement for the collection of ballot paper by voters. And there is also the flexible arrangement for voters with mobility or physical issues, so that their queuing position will be recorded, but they will be allowed to wait in the polling stations when the turn is up for them to collect the ballot papers. But after the election, we've heard from the community that we should, for certain age groups or for certain voters who cannot physically stand for hours to wait for their turn, so that they will be given some priority or preferential treatment, or there's some particular groups of voters should be allowed to vote without queuing. For example, should we allow those who are over 70, pregnant women, people with physical or mobility problems, should be afforded special treatment, or should be given priority in polling? We would like to listen to the public on these issues.
Another issue is whether electors can inspect the crossing out of their personal particulars on the register. According to the laws, electors who are given a vote, the name and Hong Kong identity card number would be crossed out on the register to indicate that he or she has collected a polling paper. However, the ballot papers are not identified. When an elector collects a polling paper, such arrangement would allow the candidates or their agents to oversee the entire polling process. In order to maintain confidentiality of the polling arrangement, electors cannot see personal particulars on the register because it carries the particulars of other electors as well. But in order to enhance transparency while maintaining ballot confidentiality, we would consider allowing electors to see whether their own particulars, including name and HKIC number, have been crossed out. So we are carrying out a consultation in this regard in order to solicit public views, and recommendations are also welcome. At the district council elections, I'd like to talk about the problem of order at counting stations. At the recent DC elections, some members of the public might be aggrieved, or they might not be familiar with the counting procedures. Some of them yelled or even heckled counting officers, and they interfered with the counting process. This place a heavy pressure or burden on the relevant staff, and it was unfair to them. According to the laws, the presiding officer would judge whether problematic ballots are valid or not, and according to the laws, the decisions of the presiding officers shall be final. If anyone is aggrieved at the decisions after the results were announced, they can file an election petition, and the courts would come up with a judgment. According to the legal procedures, the presiding officer has to make a decision on polling nights, so imposing pressure on them would not change the situation and would only lead to delays in the announcement of results. At some polling stations, the presiding officers were surrounded by a lot of people, and based on the sizes of polling stations, we impose a limit on the number of public members who could oversee the counting process, and their names and HAIC numbers have to be registered. Many members of the public recorded the counting process at the venues, and we would consider recording the counting process as well. I stress that this is just for the counting process, but not the voting. And we are obliged to enhance public awareness on the entire voting and counting process, so publicity and education are very important. Ballot papers at some ballot stations had to be transported to the main station for counting. There were ballot boxes of different colors at ballot stations. All these would be laid out in detail in our guidelines to facilitate understanding. And when determining problematic ballot papers, there was a lot of controversy. So the candidates and their agents might preside over the counting process. We had a template of what constitute problematic ballot papers. We would consider exhibiting these samples to the public. These samples were taken from past cases, and they would be displayed. As for the legislative amendments, For this exercise, the scope will be similar to the recent election. For example, when publishing the valid, not nominating persons, the address requirement would be amended. And for third parties who are not agents, if they publish certain claims online that constitute electoral advertisements, if only electricity tariffs and internet charges are incurred, even if these constitute electoral advertisements, and third parties would be exempt from criminal liability. And you can refer to the table under the words from the chairman, and some examples are listed for reference. And the electoral guidelines would stress that potential candidates should pay attention to the definition of candidates with regards to election expenses under the ECICO. This would include candidates, potential candidates, or persons who indicated that they would like to run, whether or not they have submitted the nomination forms as to whether a person has indicated that he or she intends to run. The consideration would be based on substantial circumstances. We would look at the intent to run for an election, whether he or she has disclosed to the public that he or she intends to run, or whether his or her acts are part of the electoral election campaign. So I remind persons who intend to run to pay attention to such arrangements, or else all the expenses incurred must count towards the election expenses. Like I said, the public consultation will last from today till the 7th of April. I welcome views from the public on the proposed guidelines. There will be publicity campaigns, including radio announcements, APIs, as well as posters and advertisements. The proposed guidelines can be found on the EAC website, www.eac.hk. You can also visit the EAC office as well as Home Affairs offices of different districts.
In view of the recent public health issues, we are not going to conduct any public consultation forum this time, but the general public can still send in their views through the mail, email, etc. Whether you are for or against our proposals. But please remember that the deadline is the 7th of April. Anything that is received beyond that date will not be considered. And then, depending on what we learn from the public consultation exercise, we may revise the final version. And then in early June, about June, the guidelines will be published. Let me now talk about voter registration. To ensure accuracy of voters, especially in respect of principal address and also qualification to be a voter in the FCs. In this 2020 cycle, starting from the 5th of February, up to April, we are going to send out 90,000 letters of inquiry, and those who are contacted have to respond by the 2nd of May for the purpose of updating the electoral register. So if you receive a letter from the REO, please respond by the 2nd of May. Otherwise, the names of the particular voter might be deleted from the register. And also, if there's a change of address, according to the current legal requirements, a proof of the latest address will be needed in the response. Thank you for coming today, and we're now ready to take questions. Tell us which organization you represent. I'm from commercial radio. My name is Chan. You talk about the proposal to allow certain voters priority in casting their votes in polling. Are they given a special queue to join, or would there be a quota for such people, or a chip will be distributed to such voters? And also for the monitoring of counting, are you going to impose a numeric cap on the monitors present at the stations? Are you concerned that this might undermine people's ability to monitor the process? Would it lead to judicial review? On the question of eligibility, and if some people conduct primary election for the purpose of choosing candidates, would the expenses start to count towards their election expenses at that point? Last time, we had a major issue, and that is that there were many people turning up in the first hour in the morning. Some people thought if there was some disruptions, the polling will be halted, and then those who had cast the votes will be counted, but not anyone who hadn't voted yet. But that's a misunderstanding. On the polling day, we allow 15 hours for people to vote. If for whatever reason the process has to be suspended, for example, in the past, on one occasion, the process had to be suspended due to flooding. If that's the case, we'll allow the time to make up for the lost hours. So there's no need for people to rush. So in the last elections, there were many voters in the morning hours, but not in the afternoon. On the question of queuing, well, you know, in Hong Kong, people queue for the various matters. It's a queuing culture that we all like. But there are people who cannot stand for prolonged period. But there were more cases like this in the last elections. Therefore, we allow them to say have a chair while waiting, and then when the voter's term is up, he or she will be allowed to go to collect the ballot paper. So we are all ears about such possible arrangement for special categories of voters. Much will depend on what we hear from you, and also whether the proposed arrangement is feasible. And also, at present, many people would go to the counting station, which will be the polling station turned counting station. These stations might not be very big, and therefore it could be very crowded. So we want to regulate the number of people present. But this is a question of getting the right balance, just like a court trial. You do not allow everyone in. We must come up with an arrangement which is convenient for all. At the same time, the station should not be overcrowded, which may carry the risk of order or disorder occurrences. As for people who have announced their intention to run, well, he will be regarded as a candidate from that time onward. If the intention is made public, then the person will be regarded as a candidate. We will not specify specific scenarios as to what would count and what will not count. The guidelines will be there for all to refer to, including the courts.
Hi, I'm from RTHK. Mr. Fung, regarding the queuing arrangements for the special needs people, can you explain the rationale? There are voters who complained in the district council polls last November that they think this is actually unfair because they think that all voters should be equal, no matter you have special needs or not. Like everybody should just queue the way they did. And the second question is on the limitation on the amount of people allowed into a counting station. Would that constitute a breach of the rights, of the public's rights to enter, to observe? Is there going to be extra security measures, say the government having the video team to record what's happening inside the station for further law enforcement and so on and so forth? Thank you.
About the queuing, in the district council elections in November last year, there were queues in the first 3 hours of the polling day, most probably because there was some misunderstanding that, notwithstanding that the polling hours were 15 hours on the polling day, that when polling was interrupted, those who had voted, their votes would be counted, and those who haven't voted, they would be excluded. This is a really serious misconception because it's until the 15 hours is up, there would be no counting of vote. So there would be no hurry to get your votes in the first few hours, because there would be 15 hours to do so. And concerning queuing, there's always been a flexible approach to attend to those needy. For example, those people who, for whatever reasons, cannot stand up for long hours. And on the polling day in November, we have given strong instructions. The principle first is one has to queue up to get his ballot paper, his or her ballot paper. This is exactly based on the principle of equality. But for those who had special needs, such as they cannot stand for long hours, we have made arrangement that, if possible, the presiding officer would allow them to go and sit in the polling station and have their positions in the queue marked. And upon reaching the respective position, they would be called upon to collect the ballot paper. And this is what we have done. But since the polling day, we have heard views about further facilitating or even according priority to certain groups of people to have the votes cast first. To this, we are consultant in order to receive the views. And as to what's the next step, we have to really look at the views in the consultation and as to whether it's practical to make special arrangement. And as to limiting the number of entrants, I think the principle is really reasonableness and proportionality. You cannot really squeeze an over number of people into the counting station so that the order in the counting station is not maintained. So I think that there must be a balance between how big is the counting station and how many people will be allowed in to observe the count. In any case, candidates, the counting agents or the election agents are allowed to fully observe and to stand near the counting table and to participate in the questionable ballot paper determination process. Of course, the public would be welcome, but if there are far too many people there causing problem to the counting process, I think this is doing disservice to the whole counting process. And as to recording at the counting station, the principle of secrecy of the ballot is that the whole voting procedure cannot be recorded in order to protect voting secrecy. But as we see, the counting process are very often recorded either by the public or sometimes by members of the media. So we are thinking of whether it is also conducive to good record that is recorded on the part of the RDO. But we are at this stage only inviting views as to the pros and cons.
Well, sorry, would the camera be facing the crowd instead of facing the ballot papers in that sense?
No one can record the ballot papers. This is a problem of order. I don't think the ballot paper will create any problem of order, so it must be the crowd, logically speaking.
The lady in blue, please. I'm from TVB. The first question, in the past district council elections, we saw that the offices of some candidates were vandalized or set on fire. If this happens in the coming electoral elections, what would be the response? And given the epidemic, if the NCOV epidemic has not receded by the time the election comes around, would the EAC install special arrangements? First of all, in terms of the conduct of the election and balloting, there are strict requirements in place, legally speaking. One consideration is public safety or order, and the second consideration is whether, for example, if the typhoon number 8 or the black rainstorm signal is in force, and the third consideration is public health. According to the laws, if the circumstances are serious enough to hamper the election or balloting process, then consideration will be made. And in terms of weather and the epidemic, the EAC can deal with the circumstances of specific elections or the entire election. But for weather-related factors, the presiding officer would consult the EAC. But for the entire elections as a whole, whether it is the district council or electoral elections, only the chief executive is empowered to make a decision. All along, we have been looking at whether the balloting process would be hampered or interfered with in any way before we come up with proportionate arrangements. For example, if certain ballot stations had to be suspended or closed, then we would make specific arrangements. If certain balloting stations were related, then we would also make decisions. If a ballot station is suspended by not more than 1.5 hour, then we would proceed. Otherwise, if the station has to be closed for more than 1.5 hour, we must resume the balloting or counting after 7 days. According to the laws, we can only postpone the election by a maximum of 14 days. So these are the legal requirements. As for what happens before the elections, we are not targeting individuals. We would look at whether the entire elections can proceed, even if specific candidates are affected. For instance, elections cannot proceed at certain constituencies, then we would give consideration. According to the laws, if anyone faces corruption or illegal activities, he or she can lodge an election petition. There is still time before the local elections. We would monitor the situation, including the social circumstances and health situation, before we decide on the arrangements. I'm from Stan News. As for the restriction on the number of people who can attend to the counting, you mentioned that courtrooms have restrictions on the number of attending people, but there are television links to allow the public to watch the trials, but why would people who attend to the counting have to have their names and HKIC numbers registered? This is a problem of order. At the courts, we do not see any problems of order, but at the past, at the recent election, there were plenty of such issues. That's why we are soliciting public views. First of all, a correlation between the size of the venue and the number of attending people is a logical deduction. We must strike a reasonable balance for matters of public affairs. We do not seek to limit public participation. At the recent election, we could only complete the counting on the second day or the day after polling day, due to a number of issues with order. So if there are issues of order, the counting might have to be delayed. But of course, our goal is to complete everything in one go, so we would consider these aspects.
Hi, Mr. Feng. Elvin from South China Morning Post. I have 3 questions. I want to start by asking that the nomination procedures remains largely unchanged from previous years. This is despite the Court of Final Appeal has made the ruling on some of the election, one of the landmark cases on election petitions. Why do you allow this sort of vagueness on the powers of the returning officers to exist, instead of choosing to spell out to accord the candidates being disqualified a chance to respond and other allegiance requirements? And as a matter of principle, could you also clarify, for candidates who were being disqualified in past elections, could they still stand in is there a clean slate for each election to start i.e., if they were disqualified last time, could they still stand this time, given they have a change in political allegiance? My second question concerns with the queuing arrangement. In answering a previous question, it seems rather cautious in your answer. Are you really strongly standing by this new queuing arrangement, or if there's, let's say, strong opposition from sort of parties, you are ready to shelve it or give it some thought to future? And is it a non-exhaustive list as you list out, or does the discretion rest on the presiding officer, i.e. anyone who has a special need, for instance, someone broke his leg, someone who has a kid to attend to, they would also be given the same priority in their circumstances? And my final question concerns with the latest coronavirus outbreak. Of course, there's some of the health experts predicted it could last for quite some time, even in the winter. Under what circumstances would EAC consider postponing the, given circumstances, to consider an adjournment of the election if the epidemic continues or even worsen? Thank you.
The nomination has two aspects. One is eligibility or qualification. Secondly, the law stipulated that there will be a declaration by the candidate of upholding the basic law and allegiance to the HKSAR. They are all questions to be answered and determined by the returning officer, and the EAC has no part to play in the individual decisions or the laid down guidelines. The court had actually laid down guidelines, and the court has indicated that this determination must be done by the returning officer. But as to individual decision, there may be problem arising for procedural fairness, as to which the court has to make a particular decision against the returning officer. They are all within the present system and set up under our law. And as the EAC takes no part in the actual decision, all we do is to set out the law and the process so that everyone knows what one has to be involved in. As to queuing, we have always maintained queuing as a fair procedure in collecting the ballot paper. But of course, there may be people with special need. And in November, we have made the decision and informed the presiding officer that while maintaining equality by queuing, if there was special need, for example, people found it difficult to stand for a long time, if circumstances permit, they could allow them to go in and sit down and then to wait for the turn, having the position in the queue marked. I think we always have to approach all these kind of practical problems with some sense of reasonableness. We would like to have a fair process, but sometimes that if there were special needs, we have to deal with it. Otherwise, it may become unfair situation. We have actually dealt with it by allowing people to sit down and have the position marked. But we have heard other views, and then that's why we are consulting the public as to what else or what more that we could do, or whether we should be doing it or not. As to the epidemic situation, really we have to watch out, and because actually now is March, and then will be still half a year to go, and then nearer the time we'll be consulting the expert opinion, doctors, public health officials, and things like that.
So just to clarify on the queuing is, does the presiding officer has the discretion? So let's say if someone has a kid which is not listed in the proposal, could they still somehow be given some consideration?
The presiding officer has been given by the law the power to run an orderly polling station. And then that's why he can make decision in view of the specific situation arising. If there were special needs, then he would, according to what is really required, bearing in mind fairness and equality, deal with the situation. And there would be far too many scenarios to list here, but then the principle first is equality and fairness. But if there were special needs, such as, all sorts of people have special needs in all sorts of public service situation, I think, again, bearing in mind equality, we bring in a good sense of reasonableness and humanity.
Mr. Justice Fung, I'm from Apple Daily. You propose that elderly people, etc., would be given certain arrangements. From whom did you learn about this suggestion? In the past, DC election, many people objected very strongly to giving the elderly voters special treatment, and the government actually issued a statement saying that there was no such preferential treatment. So how come suddenly you are proposing this so that queue jumping will be allowed by these people? And also, is there any particular parameter or indicator that would warrant the postponement of the November electoral election? And in June, you are going to announce the finalized guidelines. You are not going to organize any public forum so that the public will not get a chance to ask you questions and offer comments. So when you make the final decisions on the guidelines, would you give a full account on why you accept or do not accept certain views? The first principle to observe is that the queuing must be done in a fair manner. But if for people with special needs, actually in the past, the presiding officer did have the power to exercise some discretion. The presiding officer was authorized to make sure that there was order. So the presiding officer has to be flexible. It's not really about observing some rigid rules. So we gave the guideline to the presiding officer saying that the voter may be allowed to have a seat while waiting. Well, when we have heard from people that there were certain suggestions, we would like to put it forward. First of all, we have to make sure that it's fair. And there are many ways of doing this. Some would say that preferential treatment should be allowed. And then the next question is, in what way should preferential treatment be allowed, and how is it to be implemented? And the last reporters asked that we are not very specific. That's the very point of having a public consultation. Last time I said giving the voter a chair would be fair, but some would say this is actually not fair. On the public consultation forum, well, this is one part of consultation. But in the past, most views were received in writing. Views in writing are usually much more detailed. We have already explained what the reasons why we would like to have certain guidelines. So it's self-explanatory. If we decide to go down a certain route, you know why. The EAC take care of two matters. First, legislation-related issues. For example, not counting expenses incurred through the online advertisement. And we said in the past that we didn't have that power to waive the expenses. So the solution lied in changing the law. And now on the question of whether it will be fair in allowing a different queuing arrangement, all members of the EAC would like to see fairness done. And I believe people should have trust in the EAC. We have never proposed anything that would amount to queue jumping. We want to have something that is both fair and reasonable. If you say it's queue jumping, it's already a kind of judgment. We never say it should be queue jumping. As for how are we going to assess the epidemic situation, or the EAC will certainly listen to experts in coming to a decision. We have a difficulty here. Once the election is scheduled, we must proceed with it. That's the number one task. But if something happens that prevents it from happening, then we can postpone the elections by at most 14 days. We want to go for the most practicable approach. If you want to do something, and if because of a huge difficulty you cannot do it, then I think people will understand why it cannot be done. It will be based on evidence and reasons.
The lady in grey, please. I'm from cable TV. Mr. Fong, you said the queuing arrangements must consider the principles of fairness and impartiality, but according to the consultation paper, according to the wording, needy people can enjoy priority in voting. So in terms of the concept of priority, does it indicate that you have certain views when you drafted the paper, since you use this word, apart from allowing them to take a seat? Are there other ways to allow or certain people to have priority? Some elderly people are seen as supporters of the pro-establishment camp. So in the future, if there are changes to queuing arrangements for elderly electors, would it create an impression that certain electors or staunch supporters, so-called, can enjoy priority? You said the presiding officers must exercise discretion. Does it mean that the PROs would make all the relevant decisions? Are you going to take the threshold of 65 years old or people who hold elderly citizen cards? The principles of elections are impartiality and fairness, but if you impose a restriction on the number of public members who oversee the counting, would it go against such principles? In order to maintain order while upholding these principles, would the EAC come up with ways to balance all the considerations? At the recent elections, we allowed some electors to take a seat. That was our decision at that time. As for the other aspects, we would take in views from all sides. As for political consideration, there is none of such whatsoever from our side. We would only look at the actual needs. We are offering help because there are actual needs. For instance, for electors with guide dogs, we need to give them space to accommodate their guide dogs. So we would take in reasonable views. As for the restriction on numbers, we would certainly allow public participation. But there were cases in which the venues were full crowded of people and counting could not proceed after 10 hours or so. So we must look at all the aspects. The EAC does not have any presumptions. We would look at views offered by anyone. We would assess all the grounds before we make decisions. We have no presumptions at this stage on what would be done. In terms of fairness, like at the last election, we also embraced equality, and now we would solicit views from all. Mr. Justice Fung, I'm from Now TV. I'd like to ask about the priority queuing arrangement. One of your options is to allow those aged 70 or above to enjoy priority, but there are general views that this age bracket are pro-establishment, and they are. How can you convince people that this age bracket could enjoy priority while other adults would have to join another queue? How can you convince the public that this is not against the principle of fairness? As for electronic counting or the use of electronic means in distributing the ballot papers, does the EAC have any views, and whether these electronic arrangements can be installed in the coming legislative elections? At the last legislative elections, there was an Operation Thunder Go, and the pro-establishment camp thought it was a vote allocation exercise. What was the follow-up results of the EAC? Could this proceed again, or if this happens again, would the EAC interfere? Our considerations are based on actual needs, but not political ones. For acts with political consequences, we would assess whether the act itself is acceptable or not. As for the queuing arrangements, we wish to deal with a problem we saw last time, and we will also solicit views. As for electronic distribution of ballot papers and counting, this is something that has been studied by the EAC, but this would take time. Public services, many public services have been suspended for some time. And in terms of electronic vote counting, the EAC adopts electronic counting. Why can electronic counting be done with the EOC but not at other occasions? There are different aspects to the legislative elections, including geographical constituencies, as well as the district council second constituency. And based on the lists of candidates and the size of the lists, the ballot papers can accommodate a host of extra information, including photographs, as well as logos and names of affiliations. So our ballot paper is physically large. Currently, the machines owned by the EAC are not physically large enough. And for machines that are large enough, the EAC ballot paper would require the elector to stamp a chop with a tick. So if we do not amend the size of the ballot paper for the geographical constituencies, this would be a challenge. For the DC second constituency, this is borderline feasible. But the Well, we are testing all the technical aspects. As for electronic distribution of ballot papers, this is something we are studying as well. Well, if there are problems, what are we going to do with the machines, or are we going to use a new set of paper, or should we do both? Well, in that case, speed would be an issue, because if the machines break down, what are we going to do?
And on crossing out the particulars, well, in the past we were very mindful about privacy, because you shouldn't allow the voter to access other voters' particulars. But if we do both, electronic and print ballot paper, will end up slower. We have to be very careful to ensure that whatever we do is feasible. We want to maintain confidentiality, and on the other hand, we allow the voter to witness the crossing out of his entry on the register. There are accusations saying that some people are spending money on behalf of candidates. Well, actually, the EAC conduct exit polls. Why is it possible? We can only regulate what happens within the polling station, not anywhere outside the polling station. On the polling day, the EAC is authorized to regulate the conducting of polls in the non-canvassing zone. We have strict rules about this, and then such polls are not allowed to be part of the electioneering campaign. And we are not a law enforcement agency, so cases of breach will have to be investigated by the ICAC. So your questions should better be put to the ICAC. We are dealing with some other complaints. For example, they will be asked to sign statutory declarations that they will not do things that we prohibit. And if they violate they breach that particular promise, that it will be against the law. But we are not a law enforcement agency. On the question of giving preference treatment to voters, the definition of a senior citizen is 65 at present. Why do you propose that the line should be drawn at 70? Would there be a problem of order if this is adopted? Well, we are going to listen to the public first. It's just apparently an appropriate age limit. It can be anything, because if you set any age to start with, you always ask why not some other thing, some other age. On the question of witnessing the crossing out of one's entry on the register, on the last polling day, there were people complaining that some voters did not have to show their ID cards before they got their ballot papers. How can people know that if one's own entry has been crossed out on the register? You're saying that the presiding officer is responsible for monitoring the polling. Would you install some CCTV to enable the presiding officer to do this? And if it can be proved that the entry has been deleted without the voter knowing, would another ballot paper be given to the voter? And on the question of the threshold, age threshold of 70, why 70? Are you going to do something for those just under 70? Are you concerned that there will be a public outcry once this is implemented? Well, we are still collecting views. We would consider all views received before making a decision. And here, on the question of ballot secrecy, confidentiality must be observed. According to the existing electoral law, no one can be allowed to tell people whether he or she has voted or not. We cannot twist the law to allow this to happen. It's said that someone could get a ballot paper without the ID presented. And some said this could be done by a photocopy of the ID. In the past, the law didn't specify what kind of ID will be needed. It would only require the voter to satisfy the polling officer that he is a voter. So even without an ID, a voter was given a ballot paper. We understand that was a controversial provision, so we proposed changes to the law, and the government did it. And now we allow we only accept Hong Kong ID or the SAR passport, where you can find the Hong Kong ID number, because the register is arranged in such a way that you follow the Hong Kong ID number. There are people with the same names. So without the ID number, you never know who is who. There were past complaints saying that their names have been crossed out without their knowing. So it's a question of fire prevention visas, burglary prevention. To prevent fire, it's best to have all doors open, but to prevent burglary, it's best to keep all doors closed. So it's a question of balance. So if someone goes to collect a ballot paper, and the agent for candidates can walk around to monitor the process, but they are only allowed to observe, to monitor, but not to interfere. I think it's a question of trust. We cannot say that we don't trust the system just because someone has complained about the process. There are complaints saying that their names are crossed out before they turn up. Yes, there are quite a few of such complaints so far. We have referred the matter to the law enforcement agency. Because the design of the system is that there should be nothing, no evidence is collected on whether the voter has voted or not. We cannot go on from one extreme to another extreme. If you say that when something happens to the system, I will not trust the system anymore. Well, the thing to consider is that you should look at the evidence to see whether you should have faith or trust in the system. Well, yes, the system has been queried by some people. Some of the complaints have been referred to law enforcement agencies. It would take a lot of inquiry to ascertain what really happened and to maintain confidentiality in the polling station. We cannot try to find out why such complaints arise in the first place. We can only do this after the polling.
Final question. I'm from our THK. As for the definition of candidates, why is it being widened? Why would the any invalidation by the returning officer be included? You talked about the intents to run for an election. So if a member of the public posts a photo on his or her social media account and just with simply a hashtag of intent to run for the legislative election, would it constitute an intention to run? The definition has not been broadened. It has always been this way, and I'm just reiterating this fact. As for specific circumstances, the EAC would not offer legal views. Legal views depend on the actual case. The example you cited, I can only talk about it from a broad point of view in terms of principles. But I like to stress that persons should seek legal advice if they have any doubts. Thank you very much.